Welcome. My name is Kerry Colanisi, and I am the director of the Penn program on regulation at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. The program is proud to sponsor an important daily publication called The Regulatory Review, which is edited and produced by our extraordinary students at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. Today's lecture is part of an annual distinguished lecture series on regulation that we hold at Penn Law. But this year, it also commemorates the 10th anniversary of the Regulatory Review, which first started publishing in late 2009 under the name of RegBlog. And during the last 10 years, of course, much has happened in the United States and around the world in the area of regulation. There have been a great many changes. 10 years ago, we were in the aftermath of a great global financial crisis. And today we're living through a great global public health crisis. 10 years ago in the US, the House, Senate, and White House were all in Democratic control. Today, the United States is as polarized and conflicted politically as ever, although perhaps it's poised to find itself soon to have both houses of Congress and the White House again in one-party control, or at least we will see. But throughout all the changes, conflicts, and controversies of the last 10 years, the publication we're celebrating today, the Regulatory Review, has been putting out new content on a regular basis, literally thousands of essays published on all range of regulatory topics by experts from around the world, and hundreds of students who have contributed their sweat and toil to the editorial and writing enterprise. So I want to thank all the current staff as well as all alums who are joining us here today, and a special thank you as well to Anna Gavin, who both put together today's webinar and who so ably helps make the Penn program on regulation run on an ongoing basis. Today's lecture was originally scheduled to be held in mid-March on what turned out to be the first day that the University of Pennsylvania shut down its in-person events and classes, along with so many other universities and businesses around the country. So I'm very grateful to Sally Katzen, our distinguished lecturer today, for being willing to reschedule this event and deliver this lecture today through Zoom. Before I introduce Ms. Katzen, I just want to share some logistical details with those of you in the audience. After the lecture, there will be time for me to ask Ms. Katzen questions from all of you in the audience. So to submit a question for me to ask of our speaker, simply click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You might have to hover your cursor over the bottom of your screen to make a menu of options appear. Once you see the Q&A button, click on it and then type in your question there. Once you submit your question, you won't see it, but I will, and I will draw from those questions in moderating the discussion. Now, some of you may already have seen that there's a chat function as well in Zoom called Chat, and you may use that to share thoughts or comments with everyone in the audience. Everyone will see what you type there, so keep your comments obviously appropriate. Our staff will be monitoring that chat room, and any inappropriate comments may result in shutting down the chat or removing a commenter from the webinar. So I guess with that as a regulatory announcement, let me turn to introducing our lecturer. Today's lecture is special to me, not only for the occasion of the Regulatory Review's 10th anniversary, but also because of who we are privileged to have deliver the lecture. It's very special for me to introduce Sally Katzen to you, as she has been one of my regulatory heroes and role models from even her years in the private practice of law. Now, she served in the Clinton administration as the administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs within the Office of Management and Budget. She also served in the Clinton administration as Deputy Assistant to the President for Economic Policy and Deputy Director of the National Economic Policy in the White House, and then is even the Deputy Director for Management within OMB. She's also served as the head of the agency review group, by the way, for the Obama-Biden transition, where she had responsibility for the executive office of the president and all government-wide agencies. The impact of her efforts on regulation can be evidenced in many, many regulatory policies over her time in government. It may perhaps be best exemplified by Executive Order 12866, which President Clinton issued dealing with the regulatory review process at the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, an executive order which has remained in effect and continued to be the standard framework for regulatory review of regulation in the federal government in the United States through both Democratic and Republican administrations to this very day. Ms. Katzen has contributed greatly to the legal profession. Prior to joining the Clinton administration, she was a partner in the Washington, D.C. law firm of Wilmer, Cutler, and Pickering, where she specialized in regulatory and legislative matters. She has served in leadership roles within the American Bar Association, including serving as the chair of the section on administrative law and regulatory practice, and as a delegate to the ABA's House of Delegates. She's served as the president of the Federal Communications Bar Association and as president of the Women's Legal Defense Fund. A graduate of the University of Michigan Law School, Go Blue, where she was the first female editor-in-chief of the Law Review. She afterwards clerked for Judge Skelly Wright of the DC Circuit, and she served in the Carter administration as the general counsel for the Council on Wage and Price Stability in the Executive Office of the President. And she has, I'm pleased to say, taught law at places including the University of Pennsylvania. Today she teaches at NYU Law School. Thank you, Sally, for being here today to continue to provide a public service by giving of your insights both to the future leaders of the legal profession, here the students at Penn Law, but also to the many others of us who are on the webinar today from around the world. Sally?
Thank you, Carrie, for that very generous introduction. It is great to be here finally. As you mentioned, we started talking about this last winter, but what with COVID-19, well, here we are on Zoom rather than in person, but I'm delighted to participate nonetheless. More importantly, let me congratulate all of the people from Penn on the 10th anniversary of the regulatory review. It seems like yesterday when the project was launched, and now it's an institution. And I'm a big fan of the institution. I actually read some of the blogs, and this is significant because my TAs and RAs will tell you I'm not very adept at technology. I am also a great fan of Professor Colanesi. He is a standout superstar in our world of administrative law and regulatory practice. Remarkably, people of all stripes and all political persuasions seek his advice, and more telling, they listen to what he has to say. This is high praise indeed in this fraught world of ours. So it's a pleasure to be here to talk about my favorite subject, regulations. This has led some people to suggest that I really do need to get a life at some point. But question, do we really want to talk about regulations? In fact, as the authors of the regulatory review, aren't you slightly embarrassed by the name? I mean, regulations are so passé, they're so out of favor, they're so criticized, so despised by right-thinking people. You know, they were once accepted. even welcomed to set things right. Food safety regulations after Upton Sinclair's The Jungle. Clean water regulations after the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland caught fire from all the debris floating past the city pier. Automobile safety after Ralph Nader's unsafe at any speed. I used to drive a 1961 Corvair. But if regulations were once applauded or at least tolerated, not today. The conventional wisdom today, if we are to believe the speeches, news stories, blogs, books, etc., is that regulations are costly, burdensome, and downright inconvenient, if not disruptive of markets and life generally. They inhibit innovation, impair our competitiveness, destroy jobs, infringe our liberties. My goodness, lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Regulations. Isn't that what you hear on the campaign trail, at least from some candidates? Every election cycle. Isn't that what you hear in the halls of Congress? Isn't that what you hear from the White House? How did we get here? How indeed? Well, part of it may be the seemingly natural ebb and flow of popular opinion. After the 60s and 70s, with the creation of NHTSA and EPA and other regulatory agencies, we elected President Reagan, who vigorously campaigned against the government and whose antipathy to regulations was well known and was embodied in his executive order 12291, which established centralized review by OMB of all proposed and final draft regulations, and it set decisional criteria for approval of those drafts. Namely, benefits had to exceed costs, and agencies had to choose regulatory alternatives that maximize net societal benefits. Then came President Clinton, and as Justice Kagan wrote in her seminal piece for tenure at the Harvard Law School, there was a return to a regulatory rather than a deregulatory approach, albeit the benefits always justified the cost, especially in the area of the environment, health, and safety. Back swung the pendulum with George W. Bush, pushing back on environmental health and safety regulations. Although, curiously, the total number of regulations during his administration was nonetheless very high because of all the regulations issued in the aftermath of 9/11, such as hardening potential terrorist sites, like strengthening the doors of cockpits, banning liquids and gels and anything that could be used as a weapon on planes, and expanding the collection of information from citizens, notwithstanding privacy concerns. Then came President Obama and the resurgence of new regulations in the face of intransigence or gridlock by the Congress, especially with respect to environmental protection, like the Clean Power Plan and Waters of the United States, and workers' rights, like increasing the number of employees eligible for overtime pay, and protecting investors, like the fiduciary rule, and implementing the Affordable Care Act and the Dodd-Frank Act. And now we have President Trump, who at one point vowed to eliminate 75% of the regulations on the books, and whose initial strategist, Steve Bannon, spoke of dismantling the administrative state. Incidentally, the Trump administration is not only hard at work trying to modify or rescind Obama-era regulations, but is also adopting a more lenient enforcement policy of those regulations still on the books, including, for example, declining to impose fines on nursing homes on a per incident basis rather than a per day basis, a move that has had grave implications with the outbreak of the coronavirus crisis. We also potentially have a new resurgent player on the field, the Supreme Court. which with 2 new appointees and another in the wings, is considering resurrecting the non-delegation doctrine. Only ad law lawyers know what this is all about. And or limiting deference to agencies to supposedly better reflect the founding fathers' perception of good government. You probably would not be surprised to know that I have rather strong views on both of these topics, but that's for the Q&As later or perhaps another day. For present purposes, it's enough to say that the critiques of the administrative state as we know it are coming from a variety of powerful sources. So are these developments part of the historic ebb and flow we've seen in the public's attitude about regulations? Is this period we're in just part of a normal process? I think not. With great regret, I don't think there's anything normal about where we are. The antagonism to regulations today is palpable, and truly the rhetoric is all out of proportion to reality. Whereas throughout Reagan and both Bushes, there was a strong disinclination to regulate, there was also a recognition that some regulations were salutary. Think of Reagan's removing lead from gasoline. It was President George Herbert Walker Bush who brought us the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act, along with the implementing regulations. And George W. Bush issued regulations implementing his signature legislation, No Child Left Behind. Today, there is no good reg, except perhaps to limit women's reproductive rights and further burden immigration. But regulations on businesses or financial institutions or healthcare providers are presumed illegitimate and inappropriate, and they should be reviewed and rescinded. And this is the mantra and the goal, even though there has been opposition to the rollback of rules regarding methane emissions, fuel economy standards. These are objections coming from the regulated entities, but nonetheless, we're getting rid of those regulations. How did we get to this place? And I think I'm going to pause just to regroup for a second, calm myself, and try to think rationally. Because if there's a plausible explanation for these attitudes, we might be able to do something to rectify or ameliorate the situation. I think I push forward with that hope. So let's think about possible explanations. One, or at least a contributing factor, comes from political science and economics, namely what's commonly known as the collective action problem. The theory posits that when benefits are widely dispersed, while costs are directed to a specific few, the beneficiaries are less able to mobilize support for their interests because of the free rider problem that occurs as groups get larger. In contrast, those who bear the burden are singular in their focus. Social scientists have observed this phenomenon in numerous areas where there are pure public goods, such as protection of air and water quality. The voices of those who appreciate the benefit are muted, while the opponents, the polluters in this case, howl. As a result, we can barely hear the drowned out voices of any beneficiaries who try to speak out. Meanwhile, the critics' cries for modification or repeal hog the airways and set the agenda. Not surprisingly, regulations get a very bad name. So if you don't buy that one, try another possible explanation from the field of psychology, known as selective abstraction, originally developed by the famed psychiatrist Aaron Beck. This theory refers to the process of focusing on one detail while ignoring more relevant ones, and thinking of the whole experience as defined by that one element. To compound matters, people tend to focus on the negative aspects of an event only. In other words, people tend to pocket or take for granted what is good from them or from which they derive benefit. But whoa, that which irritates, that which costs, that which hurts, that remains a sore spot and never seems to scab over and heal. So we really don't think much about safe food or workplaces, or seatbelts or airbags, or whether a used car may be fatally defective, or whether local banks can keep our deposits safe, or Social Security checks are going to arrive on time, or markets are going to keep functioning, notwithstanding information asymmetrics, unless and until something goes wrong. But we do harp on the absurd complexities of tax forms, or the long and complicated building and occupancy permit applications, or maybe how unconscionably difficult it is to sign up for student loans to the students or health benefits to all of us. And when politicians call for cutting red tape or eliminating burdensome regulations, you join the chorus, forgetting the good that regulations can offer. Now, 2 explanations. Try a third, which has always bothered me. Start with the politicians. Republicans, at least since Reagan, have consistently attacked regulations, whether on the stump or in office. It's red meat, pun intended, for their audiences. Blame the government, blame Washington bureaucrats, blame regulations, blame red tape for all that ails you. A real crowd pleaser, a great applause line. Usually the politicians are not very specific about which regulations they want to get rid of, just a broad brush attack on all rules and red tape. And what's surprising is that very few answer this attack. When was the last time you heard a full-throated defense of regulations? Democrats talk about healthcare as a human right and a living wage as an entitlement, but they don't spell out that these benefits reach them as implementing regulations. They don't point to any successes of the administrative state, whether from disclosures on food or medical packaging, to sanitary conditions in hospitals, to disclosures in the market, on and on. They sometimes promise smart regulations or carefully constructed regulations based on science. But what about just praising regulations? You don't hear that. And to cap it all off is the pièce de résistance. Not only do politicians rarely, if ever, speak in defense of regulations, but most people in this country do not even know where regulations come from. You guys know that they're authorized by Congress. Agencies are not free agents to follow their own whims. People don't know how regulations are developed. You guys know, with extensive scientific, engineering, economic analyses, and elaborate processes for participatory engagement by those affected. And most people don't know what good regulations do for us. One of my deep frustrations is that with the unbounded enthusiasm and support for STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, while welcome, it came at a cost, a big cost. Gone from many schools is serious attention to physical education, music, arts, drama, and civics. At least a whole generation, maybe more, may have been taught about the military and how over the years they defended our shores and brought an end to a war in Europe in the mid-20th century, but they've not learned much, if anything, about what the rest of the government does for the people and how it does it. Nor have they learned much, if anything, about the civil service, the people who go to work every day in the federal, state, and local governments to make their lives better. Now, while I wear a D jersey, I don't see this as a partisan issue. Indeed, let me invoke Chief Justice Roberts here in his most recent annual report. He asked the judiciary to promote public confidence in the judiciary through both rulings and through civic outreach. So too, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor used her prestige and authority after she stepped down from the Supreme Court, trying to revive civics in our schools. She even worked with others to develop an app that taught civics as a game, not unlike the old Schoolhouse Rock song about how a bill becomes a law that educated earlier generations of children. In any event, administrative law scholars and practitioners and students owe the same to the American public. The American public does not like or trust regulations. Who better to let them know what they're missing? Who better to talk about how to make them better without throwing out the baby with the bath? Who better to provide a roadmap using your favorite tech platforms or even in person, one-on-one or in groups when we're allowed to do that, at schools or community centers, with friends and relatives and even strangers, to provide a roadmap to better understanding and appreciation of this invaluable tool in democracy's toolkit. Think positively and use the marvelous education you're receiving here at Penn and your in-depth understanding of the reality of regulations to spread the word. Yes, proselytize, if you will, but carry forward. Now, I think I may have carried on too long here, and I truly thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Sally. I wish we could be all together in person and give you a rousing round of applause for those insightful remarks and valuable perspectives that we have been privileged to just hear and learn from you. So thank you very much. I wanted to just start off with one question of my own, and then we have a number in the queue that are waiting from members of the audience, and we'll turn to those. But just given that you were preparing to give this lecture in mid-March, right at the start of the U.S. response to COVID-19, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about how to think about regulatory benefits in light of all of that that's happened in the U.S. and around the world in the wake of the pandemic. I guess, in other words, are there lessons about the costs and particularly the benefits of regulation that you think can be drawn from the handling of this public health crisis?
Thank you, Carrie. Yeah, there are lessons learned. I mentioned the nursing home regs, which had been promulgated during Obama to keep nursing homes safe, and those were rolled back. And without them, they were rolled back because nursing homes said they're burdensome. Well, I don't think it's much of a secret that many of the people that we've lost in the last 6 months were housed in nursing homes. And the failure to take care of them has been a tremendous loss to their families and to this country. I would doubt that a pandemic was in the original cost-benefit analysis that was done. I doubt that anyone thought that this would happen, But regs that are issued for one purpose can often have other unanticipated benefits. Another example today is masks in public spaces. Some areas, the people wear masks. Other areas, they don't. And in some of those areas, the increase in COVID-19 has spiked. How much more sensible to have a regulation that says, wear a mask when you enter a building or you're with people. And my God, today, directly on point, I understand, did not see it live, but I saw reportings of it, that the president went into the White House briefing room and he said that vaccines are going to go on the market and you do not need the FDA to test them. These are good companies, these are big companies, and if they're confident in their vaccines, then we don't need to have further approval. Well, I got to say, I'm not an anti-vaxxer. In fact, I think that's one of the most pernicious things that has hit this country. But I, for one, want independent validation before I'm going to accept or be injected with a vaccine. I'm not going to sign up for one that hasn't gotten the seal of approval from FDA. This is a tiny little thing, but it's real. Regulations can make lives better. They can save lives. And COVID-19, I think, demonstrates both parts of that proposition.
Yeah, let me turn to the audience questions now. And Maxine Sedgernick has a question that I think follows on the discussion about the vaccine manufacturers, in some sense, wanting stronger regulatory review and approval by FDA to provide a boost of confidence in their products. Maybe they're more concerned about robust regulation and regulatory benefits than the administration is, or certainly the president is. So Maxine asks about what some of the industry's own lack of support for some of the recent regulatory rollbacks in the Trump administration. I think here's of some certain automakers, for example, with rollbacks on emissions standards. What's the perceived benefit, she asks, of rolling back regulations at the opposition or disinterest, I might add, of the very industries getting regulated?
Well, one explanation that I have seen is that, sure, the big companies like regulations because they have the resources and they have the facilities to follow the regulations, and therefore they can live with them, and it gives them some protection sometimes from lawsuits. And I think that's what the makers of the vaccines, why they want FDA approval, because that would certainly help in that regard. But it's the small companies, it's the small businesses who really rail against regulations because they don't have the capacities. I think that is possibly a small part of this, but I think the real answer is that there is an ideological opposition to regulation, and it's carried forward by people who, some of them are complete libertarians who do not think the government should be doing or saying anything. And they think that CAFE standards that you were talking about with the automobiles, or the methane regulations, where the industry said, no, regulate us, please regulate us. It would be good for us to capture these emissions. These are people who say that's not the government's role. And some of these people have an entree to this administration. In the past, I mean, I've been in Washington since 1967. I've seen a lot of administrations come and go. And so frequently, um, there are multiple voices that are heard. Multiple voices get through. So you get the people who say, this is a bad regulation, but you also get others who say, it's not so bad, or we can modify it ever so slightly. This administration is unique in that the speakers are of a relatively small number, but very large influence. I'm reminded back of the landing teams that were used during the Trump transition, where people who had extraordinarily set agendas that were against any regulations won the day. And they came into the agencies. They didn't talk to the career staff. They didn't listen to the career staff. They just did what was in their minds to start with. There's been less conversations, less give and take. And I think that's why you have these phenomena of business saying, what are you doing to us? We don't want you to do this. Why are you doing this? Because he's only listening to a handful of people. I've been told it's the last person who talks to him on any given subject, but I have no personal knowledge of that. And so I'll withdraw that comment. Sorry.
Well, there's so many wonderful comments coming in on the chat and the Q&A. Many of them echo Marissa Golden at the Bryn Mawr College says the best talk ever, for example. So thank you for that, Marissa. Let's turn to another question. Actually, it relates to two questions. In fact, one by Susan Silby at MIT, who asks, what about regulation inside organizations? What she refers to in her question as re-regulation, where organizations themselves realize that they need to have some kind of rules, regardless of what the government rules are. And then a related question by Jack Wells that asks, Robin Ellison, who asks about what about learning about alternatives to regulations, to government regulations, maybe, for example, forms of self-regulation, voluntary programs, or the like. Can you comment about regulation outside of the government sector? I should also add that there's several questions here about state and local regulation as well. So if you want to comment on state and local or private forms of regulation, I know there'd be a great deal of interest among members of the audience.
Well, there's a lot to unpack in that one question, but let me say that federal regulations are one form, and it has always been, at least my position, that the government should regulate where there's a market failure. If private companies can deal with the situation in a salutary way and carry forward, then God bless them, do it. And to the extent that they're civic minded and they worry about whether they're polluting the stream that runs next to their water, that runs next to their plant, or whether they're protecting their workers to cut down on workmen's compensation suits, or because they care about their workers, it doesn't matter. If they want to self-regulate, that's fine. And that's appropriate. And it's only when you don't have companies that care about those kinds of things that I think you have to think about regulation, and whether it be at the federal, at the state, or at the local level, depends very much on the kind of situation that's involved. Many of the regulatory programs, as you know, are joint programs. EPA will set standards for air quality or water quality, and then it is the local municipality that will be translating those, or the state, which will come up as a state implementation plan and set the limits, and then the local entities will be implementing them. So you can often have 3 tiers of government coordinating and cooperating. And that's appropriate because a one-size-fits-all is not usually a good answer. Ordinarily, one-size-fits-all is going to be over or under inclusive, or both at the same time. And so how you regulate, by whom you're regulating, in what way you're regulating, are all very flexible tools that you should be thinking about. Is this the best solution? And that's why most rulemaking at the federal and the state level involves a notice and comment process. So the wise people can say, here's what we think should be done and here's why, but then the comment is from the persons who bear the burden or who would receive the benefit to say, doesn't make sense, not the best way forward. There are better ways of doing this. And so it's with the educating of the agency through the notice and comment process, it's through the interagency review at the federal level of getting the input of different agencies on an agenda or a proposal of a particular agency, which may have tunnel vision on one thing and not realize the unintended consequences that are going to move over. More discussion, more exchange of information, more data, it invariably leads to better decision making. It takes time and it takes resources, and these are real concerns. But I think that it's part and parcel of a tailored response. And so going back to your original question, if the company wants to tailor to its needs and its problems and its resources and does so in an efficacious way, wonderful. The issue is, if it doesn't, what's the fallback? Where's the safety net? Because an employee at a small business is just as possibly injured on the job as in a big business. And it's the employees' health and safety we should care about.
Yeah. So this allows me to turn to a question about climate change, which is a clear market failure, which is a problem that has prompted responses at the local, state, national, and international levels. Rob Staven asks a question about how to analyze this. So Rob Stavens at Harvard Kennedy School asks about estimating the social cost of carbon, which is used in the analyses that OIRA reviews. The Trump administration, he notes, has changed the discount rate from 3% to 7%, and it has only taken into consideration the domestic impacts in the US of climate change rather than more global estimates of the effects of a heated planet. And the result, he points out, is that whereas the Obama administration estimated the social cost of carbon at about $43 a ton of CO2, the Trump administration's estimate is as low as $1 per ton. He asks if you have thoughts and could comment on these changes.
Well, Rob is correct that the change from the Trump administration to the from the Obama administration basically came about as two conceptual decisions. One, to focus on domestic rather than international, and two, to focus on the discount rate. And the two combined led to an evisceration of the social cost of carbon, which had been very sensibly done. Look, I think they were wrong, flat out wrong, stupidly wrong. And in both instances, we know that air does not respect boundaries. It doesn't respect boundaries of states. It doesn't respect boundaries of countries. And international global change has not only the physical transfers, but also economic, as we have changes because of climate change to various countries, that's going to have economic repercussions that are going to affect the United States. So to use a domestic only does not make a whole lot of sense. And there's a lot of precedent for using an international standard there. In terms of the discount rate, this is something on which I guess reasonably people could differ. How much are you going to discount the fact that the benefits are going to inure to our grandchildren rather than to us? Although I got to tell you that if you look at the frequency of forest fires taking place or the violence of the hurricanes and the storms taking place, I'm not so sure that we're not experiencing an awful lot of current crises manifesting itself now. But on those 2 points, there had been a lot of thought in developing the Obama social cost of carbon. It was an interagency group. It was run by, out of OR actually, an OMB, and it was designed to incorporate all of the science, all of the economics, all of the contributions of the disparate groups of persons, including the Treasury Department and others that take a relatively conservative view of these in interagency processes. It was rescinded without a thought, without any consultation, without any kind of elaboration. There was no outreach to universities. There was no outreach to other scientific groups that could contribute to the thinking. It just went against the grain, and so it went away. Now, it didn't really go away because while they got rid of the government-wide social cost of carbon, a number of the agencies are actually continuing to use some of the older numbers. EPA is not. They don't like that. And I hope that that will change at some point. But it's both the inputs and the process, where they're getting their information and how they're thinking about it and working it through. And it's that combination that you want to celebrate. You want the best information available. You want the most thoughtful analysis of that information and data. And unfortunately, with social cost of carbon and climate change, period, we have not seen that in the last 3.5 years.
If we look ahead, Jonathan Weiner at Duke University writes a question
Hello,
to ask us to look ahead about the prospects in what he calls, quote, a next administration. I don't know whether he thinks that will be in 2021 or 2025 or somewhere down the line. But he says in a next administration, what are the prospects for renewing an even-handed approach to regulation where, as the executive order says, we regulate when the benefits justify the cost rather than deregulation that neglects the benefits, or pro-regulation that would neglect the costs, I suppose, too. What do you see looking forward?
Well, one thing I've often said is that I smashed my crystal ball in 2016 with the outcome of that election. I never expected it. I didn't foresee it. It strikes me that it's hard to predict. If there were a new administration, if it were a Biden administration, I see a couple of things happening. One will be an attempt to undo Trump's undoing of Obama era regs. So a lot of the things that have been rolled back will be brought back, and this can be done in a variety of ways, some more expeditiously than others. But I don't think that's sufficient, and I hate to borrow his campaign slogan of Build Back Better, but I think what they have in mind and what they should have in mind is an attempt to learn from our experiences and improve if possible. So that on the social cost of carbon, I would expect them to reconvene the group, not just go back to the Obama numbers, but reconvene the group and try to use the most recent data, the best science, the best thinking on this issue. And if it comes out differently than before, so be it. It will be based on the legitimate data and analysis that we have. I also see, I think, given the situation in this country with what I would call marginalized groups, Blacks, Browns, women sometimes, in other areas, that there will be more emphasis on leveling the playing field from those who are affected by the regulations, what I would call the regulatory beneficiaries. They're not often at the table. They're not often listened to. Much of the rulemaking process is between the regulated entities and some of the very good NGOs and public interest groups that are fighting the fight. And what I think would be important is to be able to hear more from those affected and to think about ways of opening greater access. I also see that there'll be more of an emphasis on filling some gaps in the safety net. One thing we've learned from both the pandemic and the economic downturn is that there's a lot of hurt in this country. There's a lot of people who are not protected. There are a lot of holes in the safety net. And I think we're going to see more of an effort. I hope we're going to see more of an effort to focus on those and think affirmatively of what we can do more better. So it's a kind of a mixed bag. And it's a full agenda, a lot of work.
We have so many questions here that people have asked. We won't be able to get to them all. I do want to turn to one of my students, Patrick, who asks an administrative law question. And I guess I also want to preface this by saying that following on the priorities that you were just discussing for a new administration, for promoting equal justice and fairness and opportunity for those who've been marginalized in society, you know, the nation has lost a giant champion in this field. And I know Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a friend of yours, Sally, and I want to offer my condolences and for your loss and for all of our loss, obviously. Maybe you want to reflect on her legacy as part of your answer to this question, but also looking forward, can you say more about the change, for example, in the non-delegation doctrine? The student asks, what's your opinion on the intelligible principle test? Do you think that reinvigorating the non-delegation doctrine is a good idea?
No.
And okay.
And, let me be clear on that and answer that one, if I may, before sure. I move to Ruth. No, the non-delegation doctrine, as I think one wit once said, has had 2 good years out of 200. That's not a great batting average. It's being resurrected, I think, as a deliberate tool to suppress the administrative state. The interesting thing is there was a recent article by some people at Yale, if I remember correctly, or was published at Yale, that goes back and looks at what happened in the earliest Congresses. There was, in fact, delegation from day one by the people who wrote the Constitution. They believed in allowing the executive to do more than what Justice Thomas stringently let out with you can fill in the gaps, or was it Justice Thomas or Justice Gorsuch? I may be losing it. But in any event, There's so many historical references. And I know people don't like legislative history, although somehow when it comes to constitutional law, the Federalist Papers get a lot of play, even though they weren't legislative history. They were written after the fact, and it was a propaganda tool to get the Constitution ratified. But in any event, there are lots of examples in the earliest Congresses of a delegation to an agency to carry out what I will call an intelligible principle that the Congress laid down. I think that's appropriate. I think this insistence on reviving the non-delegation doctrine is very short-sighted and very wrong. Let me come back, if I may, on Ruth, because I was extremely fortunate. My husband and I were friends both of Ruth and Marty Ginsburg over the years. And they were an incredible couple. She was an incredible woman, and it is not my loss. It is the nation's loss. She had an innate sense of what justice means to all of us. She would think about the rich and the powerful and the poor and the overlooked or disenfranchised. She cared about those who didn't have the same opportunities. And I must say, I fear for the future Supreme Court. I try to be circumspect in my comments, but I think another Trump appointee to the court will have grave consequences for things that I care about: women's reproductive rights, climate change, gun ownership, healthcare, voting rights. I mean, that's the essence of our democracy, and the court wouldn't take a gerrymandering case. And, you know, she chides them for that. I think when you think of those issues, the movement of the court on administrative law issues is small change. It shrinks in comparison to the fundamental principles of our country, to the issues that we should struggle with, that we should care about. And you know, whether there's a non-delegation doctrine revival or we get rid of Chevron, which I don't know, what are the judges going to do if you get rid of Chevron? They're still going to look at the expertise of the agencies. You're standing. There's another real winner that's out there. Those things will affect where I spend most of my time, but I think there's almost, they're not inconsequential, but there's of such lesser consequence that affect the other decisions. And Ruth's death will, I think, deprive all of us of someone whom we hold in awe and see hope for a better country. And that's a tremendous loss for all of us. I'm not sure what else I can say.
If we could close maybe very briefly, we just have a minute or two on maybe a more hopeful message. I want to pick up on a question that Dan Cohen has asked about,
Hey, Dan.
Given all the years of long bashing civil servants and government service generally, he says, what can we do to incentivize, he says, smart new graduates with law, engineering, epidemiology degrees to seek a career in the federal service and the regulatory process? More generally, can you offer words of advice, encouragement for the next generation to pursue the kind of path that you have traveled, that Justice Ginsburg has traveled, in giving of their talent and dedication and energy to the public service?
Well, I would say never, ever stop working for what you believe in. And when you're following your passions, it's not work. It's rewarding and it's helpful. And don't ever forget who you are. Cherish your families and friends, but also listen to people you don't know as well. And remember tolerance and acceptance. And I hope that that takes you to a path of public service. It's why I teach, why even at my age, I'm still teaching, because I want to inspire young people to public service. It is a noble calling. It is a great chance to give back. I'm a second generation. My grandparents came to this country with nothing, and there have been so many chances afforded. This is a great country, appreciating all of its flaws and all of its faults. Don't give up. I would say give of yourself. And when you feel tired, just give a little more. Get engaged. And for God's sakes, vote.
Well, wonderful way to end. Sally, you have given us so much in just this 1 hour today. You have inspired us today and through your life and your career and your commitment to public service. Thank you very much. For those of you who would like to see more, revisit this, we will be posting the recording of it on our YouTube channel through the Penn Program on Regulation. And starting Monday, we will be celebrating online the 10th anniversary of the Regulatory Review with a special anniversary series of essays, which will begin with the printed and edited version of Ms. Katzen's lecture here today. Again, I wish the hundreds of us that are online today could be together in person to give you the standing ovation, Sally, that you have rightly earned. Thank you very much again. I want to thank all the members of the Regulatory Review, our staff at the Penn Program on Regulation, Anna Gavin, and all of the members of the audience for being with us here today. So thank you very much, and go vote.